Well, thank you very much for that introduction and for asking me to be with you today. I've been told that what I say will take 25 to 30 minutes. I've got no idea, but I will make sure that I do leave some time for discussion at the end. Now, if it works. What I want to say is roughly going to be divided into two parts. One is giving you my take on reforms. HEPI has produced some analysis. In fact, it seems to me we produce what remains the definitive analysis of the government's white paper. There's been surprising reticence on the part of people, particularly in official positions. I'm dismayed, I have to say, by the attitude of some of the sector bodies, which seem to me to be really just so accepting. In fact, a senior leader said to me the other day when we were having a discussion about this, well, you know, what else could we have done? Well, I think there's quite a lot that might have been done and said that wasn't said. But anyway, so but I will give you my take on the reforms, which may be idiosyncratic, but I think I hope will be of interest. Of course, there's some uncertainty about the way it'll go still, but we do know that the effects will be substantial, whatever they will be. And then I'll move on to say something about the implications as I see them for individual universities, or some of the implications. Now, my fundamental point is that, and I think this is more of a philosophical than a useful point to make, but it's one that I think is of interest, that we have an extraordinary situation in England in the development of higher education policy. In England particularly, not the UK more generally, but of course what happens in England does impact heavily on the others, where there's a growing disconnect between rhetoric and reality, between what the government says that it wants for higher education and its proposals. And the consequence, I think, is a serious one. We have an ideologically driven policy, and I don't say that in a pejorative way at all. By ideologically driven, I mean one based on principles, whether you agree with them or not, but one that's been emasculated with compromises. And it's those compromises as much as the ideology that's so potentially damaging. Now, what is the rhetoric and the ideology? Well, it's quite straightforward. It's that markets should rule. They should, for example, govern the level of fees that students pay. And by the way, one of the interesting things that's happening recently is that there's no longer much debate in England about whether students should pay, but it's more about how much they should pay and how they should pay. And the other thing I would say in passing is that the arrangements that this government inherited from the previous government and which is retained, whereby the government lends money to the students and the student in order to pay their fees in full. So education remains free at the point of use, and students only repay when they're in work and can afford to repay. Those are among the most progressive that I've seen anywhere in the world. So the ideology is that the market should determine how much students should pay. It's that student choice should determine how universities respond and how they develop. And one element of this is to increase the range and the type of institutions that are on offer to students, and in particular that private and further education colleges should be available to a greater extent than they have been in the past. And it's that government involvement in higher education should be reduced. It's a voucher system whereby instead of the government providing funds directly to institutions, it provides funds, albeit through loans, to students, and the students provide the funding to universities in place of government funding, in place of direct government funding. And in order to enable competition and to maximize student choice, government control of the number of students that universities may recruit should be removed. Now, why can't this ideology be implemented? Well, first, the government is a victim of circumstances. It believes, and I'm not commenting on this, that economic circumstances require government spending to be cut. It's chosen to cut government spending for teaching, public funding for teaching, by 60%, by 80%. The numbers change, but they're very substantial. And they're greater than the cuts to any other service, no doubt because in students paying fees, there's a ready alternative to government funding in a way that there isn't, for example, in schools or in the health service, at least politically acceptable. So in part, these cuts are economically driven, but only in part. In part, they're born of the ideology that government funding should reduce and student funding for higher education should increase, no doubt, presumably on the basis that the public benefit is relatively small and the private benefit is relatively large. Partly, though, these cuts and the new arrangements are as a result of what I have called separately previously as smoke and mirror accounting. Although the government has to borrow substantially in order to provide the loans to students, in order to continue to provide the residual HEPI grant, to the extent that it can show an income stream in the future, it is able to take those loans off balance sheet. There is a real question about whether that income that it's assuming will come about, and I shall go into that a bit in the future. But so although the borrowing will actually be greater for the government, it can make the claim, to the extent that it can make the claim that there's an income stream, then that money goes off balance sheet and it reduces the public debt. It is extraordinary accounting, but it is accounting that's legitimate, and that is one of the arguments in favour of it. Now, one consequence of the economic constraint is that although the government would like to remove student number controls, it can't afford to do that. The finances won't allow it. So long as loans are subsidised, and for understandable political reasons the government's chosen to continue to subsidise loans very heavily, then every student that's recruited increases the government's liability. Student numbers have to be controlled, and the only realistic way of controlling them is at institutional level. And that undermines the government's ideological aversion to quotas, and it makes it difficult to extend government support through the voucher system to private institutions and to further education colleges. But the ideology also can't be implemented, partly because the ideology itself is flawed. 2 years ago, HEPI produced a report on vouchers. I have studied vouchers over a long period of time. I wish the government had read our report on vouchers before they went down this road. As far as I know, although there are a number of countries where they have vouchers in the school, at school level, the only countries that I've encountered with vouchers in higher education are Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Lithuania, and the American state of Colorado. And I can assure you that the first two of those at least don't provide a good model for us to follow. Now, the only evaluation of a voucher system that I'm aware of was that conducted by the government of Colorado a couple of years ago on its own voucher system that it had introduced itself. And the results of that evaluation are remarkable. It concluded that not one of the benefits that had been anticipated and hoped for had been achieved. And the aspirations there were exactly those that are stated here, greater choice, quality improvements, competition, efficiencies, and so on. But none had been achieved. And that surely should give pause for thought. But there are reasons of principle as well for thinking that a voucher system is a bad one for governing higher education. If we regard higher education as being important for the country and its development, and if we regard universities as being part of the infrastructure of the country, then largely to abrogate responsibility for how the system develops and to leave it to the decisions of individual students is unwise. Markets don't necessarily, left to themselves, deliver the national benefit, at least not in higher education. Leaving it to the market alone can give rise to perverse effects. And so we find, even before we've introduced the new system, that we have the entirely predictable situation where the government is busily reining in the market and intervening to stop the market from operating. For example, the level of tuition fees that most universities, relying just on market mechanisms, were proposing to charge. The proposed fees were far higher than the government had budgeted for, as we warned them would be the case. And as higher fees, as I've said, mean larger loans, and the loans are subsidised, then the government has had to intervene to control the fees that are charged. For example, the effect of the core and margin policy in particular, but at the AAB policy as well, which is an attempt to introduce a measure of competition in the absence of proper market-based competition. The incentives that the voucher system provides to universities to increase provision in the arts and humanities and social sciences, and reduce them in the sciences, because art students, by and large, produce a profit for the university, and science students don't, despite the residual HEPI grant. And the extraordinary situation where outreach activity, universities going into schools and the community to encourage people to consider higher education, will in future be funded not by the government, as it funded Aim High, for example, but by students themselves through their fees. And also, and what we've described as the arms race that the AAB policy introduces, whereby universities are almost obliged, because other universities are doing it, to offer merit-based scholarships to students who may have no particular need at all for these incentives, but which they need to do in order to attract students, to offset the attraction of other universities that are offering these scholarships. An extraordinary waste of public or semi-public resources, if ever there was one. But above all, the government has been unable to deliver its desire to free universities of quotas and to extend vouchers to students attending private institutions. So what does a government that is ideologically committed to a market that finds that it can't introduce one, what does it do? Why, it introduces a pseudo-market. Because of its determination to do what it said it would do, although it can't actually do it, it's been forced to introduce a semblance of a market. It's said that universities may recruit as many students as they want with the top A-levels, those with grades A, B or equivalent. So universities will compete. It's true they will compete, but for this limited pool of students, and such students may find that they have greater choice. But at the same time, it's cutting the number of students that universities may recruit below AAB grades, and then only universities that cut their fees to less than £7,500 may even compete, and they may compete with each other to get some of these places back, but they must compete with private eventually and further education colleges immediately as well. These are entirely supply-side policies with little regard to demand and their effects on demand. These will have the greatest impact on the institutions in the higher education sector, more so than the changes in the fee regime. The core and margin policy, cutting the number of places below AAB in universities that charge more than £6,000 and only allowing them even to apply to have them restored if they reduce their fees to £7,500, has a twin purpose. Primarily, it's to rescue the government's budget. Because left to their own devices, as we've seen, and left to the market, most universities plan to charge very much more than £7,500, which is what the government had budgeted. It badly needs to reduce the average fee, and in my view this policy does it extremely effectively, and we've begun to see that that is the case. We already know that a large number of universities that intended to charge £8,000 and more reduce their fees to £7,500, and if the government persists with this policy, as it said that it will, there's no question, it seems to me, that other universities will have to follow suit. And I'd just like to look at this chart. This is hypothetical. Two universities, one charging £9,000, the grey one, that maintains its charge at price at £9,000, the other reducing its price to £7,500. I think each with 1,000 students. And you'll see that the one that persists in charging £9,000 very quickly loses more than a third of its fee, its income, because it loses places every year. No university can afford to lose 10% or so of its numbers year after year. And those that haven't done so, other than those with large proportions, large numbers, but also large proportions of AAB plus students, will be forced to reduce their prices, or they'll face ruin. And so we saw in last week's grant announcement 30 universities losing 10% or more of their income because they lost their student numbers. That's unsustainable. Most universities will be forced to reduce their fees. And it's not just the universities that you might think that are affected. This is an aggregate slide of all the Russell and 94 group universities, and you'll see the same sort of effect. And even if they succeed in recruiting every single AAB plus student from the rest of the sector that aren't in the Russell and 94 groups, they will still lose money. This is an average, and I say it's an aggregate, but it shows the way it is. Some of these universities are going to have to reduce their prices and become £7,500 universities, not because the market demands it, but because the government demands it. And indeed, one 94 group university has already done so, and that's a smart thing to do, it seems to me. Others will certainly follow. So one of the effects of these policies will be to create a new and different hierarchy of universities, with those that recruit large numbers of AAB students at the top, and this shakeout is already going on, of course, with the expansion of the Russell Group to include the small number of such universities that weren't among their ranks. But the other purpose of the core and margin policy is to remove places from public universities, and I'm using the word public here, obviously, in a loose way, in order to be able to provide vouchers to students attending further education colleges and private universities. Now, as I've said, because of constraints in funding, that wouldn't otherwise be possible. The places have to be removed from public universities, and that's what this policy will do. There's no suggestion here that students would prefer to go to FE colleges than go to public universities. It actually reduces choice in that respect. It only increases choice in the theoretical way that it increases the range of providers or the number of places in FE colleges. It's a supply-side policy. It's hardly market-driven. And the AAB plus policy doesn't increase choice for students either, except to the limited extent that some of those universities with large numbers of AAB plus places might increase the number of such places. There's no sign that that's happening on any scale. And anyway, that would be at the expense of others that might be perfectly popular, but which will lose places. What the combination of the core and margin and the AAB measures does mean is that for a minority of students, choice may be maintained. It certainly isn't evident that it'll increase, but at the expense of the majority for whom choice will be reduced further. Has to be reduced further, actually. The larger the number of students included in the AAB, in the unconstrained category, whatever that unconstrained category and however it's defined, then the greater the cut that will be needed elsewhere. And remember that in order to maintain this semblance of reducing controls, the government has said that it intends to extend the definition of high-performing from AAB down, presumably, to ABB, and so on. Although not this year, interestingly. There was speculation that they would, but I think HEPI have persuaded them that would be unwise. Now, this policy, it seems to me, asserts that you can have your choices maintained if you're clever, and by the way, clever by and large means rich, because we know that students from better off backgrounds tend to get the better A-level results, and fewer choices if you're not. That policy might be all right on the high street, but it shouldn't be a principle that we accept in higher education. So reduced choice for students, except possibly and only possibly for those with top grades, and maybe some extension of choice to further education and private providers. Entirely supply-side action, no market at work here. No reduction in quotas, indeed an increase in quota controls. The large majority of universities will have their numbers reduced by government decision by up to 10%. No reduction in government intervention. Instead of the market determining a price, the government has done so by effectively requiring most universities to reduce their fees to £7,500. And let's be clear, if that doesn't work, I think it will, but if it doesn't, then the government will have to find other ways of getting the price reduced in order to stay within its budget. Unless things have changed since I was a civil servant 20-odd years ago, the budget that you get from the Treasury is the budget, and it's up to you. But you've got to find ways of staying within it. And instead of the market determining which universities will grow and which will contract, it'll be HEPI committees that will do so. The future of universities will be decided not by their ability to satisfy the market, but by their ability to satisfy HEPI committees. That's why I talk about this disconnect between rhetoric and reality, between ideology and actuality. The price of this disconnect and the government's determination to press on with a semblance of a market is a heavy one. We will have a bipolar system with a small number of universities charging £9,000 and the majority charging £7,500, and actually a third group of institutions charging £6,000. And by and large, it'll be wealthy children, not because of their wealth, but because of their A-level grades, attending the better resourced universities, and poorer students attending the less well endowed. Widening participation and fair access will be severely compromised. There'll be less choice for the poor, and probably not a lot more for the rich. And the government is creating uncertainty for the majority of institutions, and possibly unviability for some, by removing student numbers and reducing their income. And it seems to me it's one thing for the market and the failure of institutions to respond to the market to cause that sort of disruption. It's quite another for the government to do that. Now, I want to say something about the cost of all this. The long-term cost to the government of the subsidy that it has to give, the loans and the interest that won't be repaid, the RAB charge, what's known as the RAB charge. Now, the government has said in its white paper that it expects not to recoup about 30% of the loans and interest repayments that it's owed. That the subsidy effectively will be 30%. The problem is, in the same white paper, they gave a figure of 32%. And in the same white paper, they published a report that they commissioned from London Economics to look at the economic impact of all these proposals. And the London Economics assessment was that the RAB charge would be 37%. Now, the difference, I have to tell you, between 37% and 30% is £500 million a year. And it's a great concern that the government is apparently pretty cavalier about £500 million. You know, they say it's all very uncertain because it's a long time in the future and so on, but nevertheless, that the same document should produce, without any comment, these three different assessments seems to me to be extraordinary. But in any case, whatever they are, it seems to me we've done the analysis. The assessments of the costs are pretty optimistic, in fact hopelessly optimistic, I would say. Their calculation is based on unreal assumptions. Originally, one of the key flaky assumptions was the level of fee. They assumed 7,500 average. Well, that's actually been addressed, it seems to me, pretty effectively with the core and margin policy. Fees will, on average, reduce substantially from the levels that had previously been announced. But there are others. For example, that EU students will repay at the same rate as as UK students. We know already that that's not the case, that last year, I think less than half of the proportion of EU students repaid anything at all compared with UK students. And actually, it makes sense. I mean, if you're a Bulgarian student, I mean, you'd be laughing all the way. You know, I mean, you would come to this country. If they choose to, EU students can have free education in this country. I think, will be beyond the powers of any government to chase large numbers of EU students through their courts back home in the way that they would have to do. And also, they've made an assumption about the fact about the gender balance, and they've assumed as many male graduates in the future as female graduates, which is far from being the case. I mean, the trend, if anything, is in the opposite direction. And you can see the implications of this, given that females tend to have a shorter time in the workforce that males do. Now, those are important, but they're not as important as the other major assumption that is wholly implausible, and that is that the average salary of a graduate 30 years after graduating will be £100,000 a year in today's money, in real terms. Now, I can hear laughter, but the government justified that reasonably enough, apparently reasonably enough, by saying that's actually an extrapolation of what's happened over the last 30 years, which actually in itself I think is pretty extraordinary. I mean, I'm surprised, but it's, I think that's a fact. The mean, let's be careful about this, the mean increase in salaries for graduates 30 years on after graduating, on that basis, if you simply extrapolated the mean forward, would be 100,000 a year. Well, for a start, there are good reasons for thinking that the future will not be like the past. I mean, the Prime Minister keeps reminding of this, actually, that is the case. And you only have to look at the state of Europe's economies, which are only being kept afloat by reducing incomes in real terms. But actually, it's a bad misunderstanding of the past anyway, because it's no good simply taking the mean salary increase, the salary increase of all graduates. Because that mean is made up of a relatively small number of very high-earning graduates that have, whose salaries have increased greatly, and the majority whose salary increases have been far more modest. What matters when you're doing calculations of loan repayments is not a mean, but it's what each individual graduate will repay. And this is a slightly fussy slide, but this is actually a chart of American graduate salaries over the last, well, since 1973. And you'll see that the males and females shown separately here. The top decile have increased their salaries very substantially. The median increase has been very modest indeed, and actually the lowest paid, the lowest decile, has actually gone backwards. And that's actually, as I say, these are American salaries, but there's every reason to think that the rest of the Western world has got a very similar pattern. And that's summarized here. And it's no good just looking at these people and thinking, because these are earning a lot, it's going to push everything up, because it's not. They won't pay any more back but just because they're earning a lot. And these ones will repay far less than has been assumed. As I say, this is a summary of the previous chart. The RAB cost will almost certainly be far higher than the 30% or so that the government's budget has assumed. And we should be concerned, seriously concerned about the consequences, because if I'm right and there is a budget and the budget's going to have to be adhered to one way or another, then the money has to come from somewhere. And there, it seems to me to be three broad areas it can come from part of the HEPI, the rest of the HEPI budget. And the government's grant, the government's grant announcement last year was quite explicit about this, that the HEPI, if a grant is vulnerable, if necessary, there could be reductions in the subsidy, although given the political difficulties that the government had over increasing the fees last year, I think that is going to be politically very difficult for them. Or there could be reductions in participation. And we saw the first signs of that a month or two back, where 5,000 was knocked off next year's student number total. What is likely to be the consequence of all this? It's highly likely, I put it no stronger than that as a result of these changes, the government won't be able to fulfill its ideological aspirations, in part because it can't afford to do so, but in part because those aren't compatible with the public higher education system that delivers the public interest. Nor actually will it achieve the savings that it seeks. The present policies represent a huge discontinuity between aspirations and reality. We'll have one of the most state-controlled systems that I know in many respects. And yet, what's interesting is how the spin on all of this has got people, the objections to the government's policies is most often articulated in the sense of objections to the marketisation of higher education. But actually, in many ways, unless you regard students paying fees as being all there is to marketisation, in many ways we're moving away from the marketisation and towards a much greater degree of government control here. Now, I want to just end up by having a brief word about what all this might mean for individual universities, and here are some of the things that you might consider, all of which I've already touched on, or follow from what I've said. While the government's largely abandoned the market as the basis for development of the sector, that's not to say that competition won't exist. But the competition will be a strange one, and some of its effects will be insidious. There'll be, for example, competition for AAB plus students, and that will make many universities vulnerable to predators. Another question, how long can a university afford to continue to have 10% or so of its student numbers removed? And that would be the price that's paid for maintaining fees above £7,500. There'll be a new hierarchy of universities in the country. There'll be a shakeout, and that's already beginning. And even if in most cases, it's not a question of if, but when you do reduce prices to £7,500, you'll need to consider what you need to do and say to satisfy the HEPI committees that will decide on the reallocation of the places. The future of universities, I've said, and in some cases their very viability will be decided not by the market but by the HEPI committees. What happens to postgraduate demand as a result of these changes? Well, we don't know. And given the already precarious nature of domestic demand for postgraduate research places, that could have a serious implication for the country's research effort. And the same for part-time. Although loans are now available for part-time student fees, and that may have a positive impact on demand, fees will have to rise a lot because the HEPI grant by and large has been removed. And we'll have to wait and see whether the positive of the availability of support is offset by the negative of the much greater cost. On balance, though, I have to say this. Although there are a lot of uncertainties, although I think that a lot of what's being introduced is irresponsible and could have serious negative consequences, for the majority of universities, life won't be too bad, and in particular their income will be preserved. Because even at £7,500, I think our calculation is that preserves income by and large. But the price will be a heavy one, and the heaviest price will be borne by today's students, tomorrow's graduates. The funding of universities has been largely maintained, and I think the government deserves some credit for that, but at the expense of the next generation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bahram, for a very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. I, for one, was particularly struck by the comments that you made around the disconnect between rhetoric and reality. I think that's something that we're probably all sensing in our own institutions. And I was left really with a feeling of some pessimism and frustration. So before I open up the discussion to the floor, just a question of my own, if I may. I wondered what, in your view, was the response that you think that HEI should be taking? Basically, where next for the sector?
Well, it's very difficult this, because, of course, as HEIs, you've each got to look after your own interests, and so I draw a distinction between HEIs individually and HEIs collectively through the sector leadership. HEIs individually, my view is that you're in a bind. Those of you who are not charging, I mean, you know, the government is playing a game of chicken, or at least maybe that's unfair. Institutions are assuming the government is playing a game of chicken with them. And this policy of the ratchet, the 10% cut plus the reallocation and the free and the high-performing AAB plus policy can't continue from year to year. And that, I imagine, is why quite a lot of universities, for example, haven't reduced their prices in the first year. I think the government's made it clear that it intends to continue with this policy next year. There will be a further 10% or 8% or 9%, I can't remember what it will be. It depends, of course, on how many AAB plus students come through. But there'll be a cut next year as well, and probably the year after. And so, as I showed in that slide, universities that decided to hold on for the first year, I think will be ill-advised to hold on, assuming that there won't be further such ratchet effect in the future. So I think the first major choice for those universities that haven't reduced their prices, and I think they're still the majority, is to make a judgment about that. It'll be very difficult for some of the more prestigious universities. I mean, it'll be very, you know, a 194 group university has already decided that it's not going to be a £9,000 university. Russell Group universities are going to really have to swallow hard if they're going to be seen to be £7,500 universities, because that's the way the system will be organised in the future, not between, well, I mean, I suppose there'll still be the research and, you know, all that sort of hierarchy, but this will be a very visible distinction. You know, they can conceal it for a while by reducing, you know, having a high sticker price but low actual prices. So I think there's a whole lot of decisions there. Then there's the competition for AAB plus students. Well, I think everybody's waiting to see. I mean, perhaps it's already known. I don't know what those with high grades or high expected grades are doing this year. But we've seen already merit-based scholarships being introduced, you know, quite substantially. And I think that in the competitive environment that you're in, as I say, you know, there is this element of competition. I don't think it's a very healthy one, particularly. if other universities are threatening to poach your AAB plus students by offering them very large financial incentives to go there rather than to you, you're going to have to reciprocate. So I think there's all of this sort of thing. It's a bit early yet to know quite how all this will go, but I think there are some very difficult tactical decisions to be taken by individual institutions in many of these respects. And one general point is what size of institution is viable. How much can you? So this is related to the question of the fee. How far can you reduce in size, and still be viable?
Matthew Andrews from Oxford Brookes University. I think you've sort of very articulately pointed out the difficulties with government policy, that on the one hand they talk of market-driven economics, and on the other hand introduce policies that would be quite at home at the heyday of communist Russia in terms of central planning. There's clearly a fear, as you point out, of what might happen if the numbers are just completely released, if the cap is taken off the fee. I'm wondering if you know of any serious research, though, which has actually been done into what the impact of such a market would be, whether there would be so many more students, whether institutions really would charge astronomical fees and expect the government to pick up a funded loan for the students to pay for those fees. Because it partly strikes me that there is a fear of that happening, but less real evidence that it actually would.
Well, I think there are two things there. One is what universities can reasonably charge and hope to get if unconstrained. One of the reasons universities were able to announce fees that were so high, and it's elementary market economics that really anybody advising the government should have been able to advise them about, is that there is a large mismatch at the moment between supply and demand. Demand for higher education is very much, and has been even before these controls were brought in, very much higher, very much greater than the supply of places. And so universities could almost with impunity charge what they like. Most universities, I won't name any universities, but quite modest universities were proposing to charge the highest fee they could because the demand was there. So I think that to that extent, the fees would be higher, much higher than they are now, and there would be demand for them. On the other hand, there is, the other part of your question is, would there be, would the government's budget be bust because there'd be so much more demand from students? Well, I don't know, but we saw last year, and HEPI did a study last year of future demand, but it did look at the present demand, and there was a large amount of unsatisfied demand last year. And so even if some of the existing demand falls away, there's sufficient there, I think, to generate a much larger student body than we have at the moment. So I think the answer to your question is yes, there would be, and there's good reason for thinking there would be substantially more demand and substantial pressure on the government's budgets if the cap was taken off, both student numbers and the fee that was charged. I saw something over here. Yes.
Andy Wilson at Imperial College. I wondered, just following on from the rhetoric and reality, one of the outcomes of the market-driven economy is market failure, and whether or not, given the political environment, do we think that this government is willing to countenance the notion of a university going bust and no longer existing?
Well, market failure takes a number of forms. One of the, a university going bust isn't market failure. A university going bust, like a business going bust, is actually the market working. So your question can be answered in terms of politically, would the government be prepared to see a university going bust? My judgment is probably yes. I think they'd probably be rather pleased if a university went bust, but not too many, just to encourage the others, sort of thing, But I don't think it'll happen, actually. I think one of the triumphs, and one of the things where I think is one in the eye to those who take this view, is they point to failing universities in the past and so on and so on. Terrible. Actually, one of the triumphs of the present arrangements, and I think HEPI deserve an enormous amount of credit for this, is the way universities that were apparently failing have been nursed back to health and are now thriving and serving the national interest and as I say, retaken their place as part of the nation's infrastructure. I think far better to do that than to say, great, the university's gone bust, this is a way of encouraging others to be more rigorous. But yes, there is market failure, and there's massive market failure if you regard, and as the government does regard, market failure, universities charging too much, or not enough science students places being available, or you know, and this sort of thing. I mean, the government interventions they will claim has been to address market failure, but actually, I mean, it depends on how you define market failure. Not enough students coming into science because the cost is too high, or because universities actually think it's cheaper to provide for humanities, so they encourage more humanities, is the arrangements at work, but it is a failure of some sort. Yes?
You talked a little bit about the Russell Group and 94 group. Could I push you to be a little more specific, maybe about the top 10 and top 5, and within that, so do you...
You haven't said which university you're from?
I'm sorry, I'm Dominic Dean from the University of Sussex.
Right.
So about the top 10 and top 5, and also whether you would anticipate any genuine privatisations happening perhaps within that group.
I don't fully understand the question. When you say, what do I think about the top 5 or the top 10, what do you mean exactly? I think that they are sitting pretty, actually. I think they will charge £9,000 or whatever they can. They'll probably get the students. They will have the prestige attached to them, partly because they are able to charge the highest amount. Don't forget, higher education is a very peculiar commodity, where like things like, you know, expensive watches, the value of the product is to some extent defined by the price of the product, and we've seen this amply in the States, where I've heard presidents of Ivy League universities saying they cannot afford to reduce their prices, although they can because they've got massive endowment, because their competitor universities are charging high prices. So I think that they will have prestige partly because of the prices they charge, and they will charge whatever they can, and they will get plenty of demand. And I think that they will be sitting pretty, and I think that that there will be a fracture in the system. I don't think they'll go private. I don't see why should they go private. They're doing very well. I mean, what's the price that these universities are paying for getting, you know, well, it depends on whether, I suppose, RAE money is available to them or not. But I don't see any particular reason why they should go private. They may. I see, you're saying if they went private, they could charge even higher fees. Yes, that's true. But then would government funding be available to them? I don't know. It remains to be seen whether the government limits its loans to only a certain amount, and anybody charging more than that won't be able to get it. I believe that their plan at the moment is to have fairly limited loans available to students in private universities. Got time? Yeah, one more.
My name is Foluke from the National Open University, Nigeria.
Yes.
I'd like to know the implication of the government's policy on the international students. As we all are aware, a large percentage of the students in the UK are made up of international communities. So what's the implication of the government's decision on...
Right. Well, first of all, it is worth recalling how important international students are to UK universities, not just for honourable good reasons like, you know, the diversity of the student body and the cultural enrichment, but financially, universities now rely on, you know, international fees for 10% of their total income, which is more than the RAE income that they get, interestingly. So it is critical that they be, you know, that they are able to continue to recruit these students. And sorry, just a diversion, but the new visa arrangements are really worrying in many respects, I think, for the viability of universities if they have a serious impact on recruitment of overseas students. But putting that on one side, one thing that may happen, I just don't know, it remains to be seen, is because, especially with those universities charging £9,000, the differential between what a home student pays in fees and an international student pays in fees has reduced. I think the attraction of overseas students, the relative attraction, may be reduced, and so it could just be that, I mean, I see no sign of it, to be honest, but theoretically it could just be that universities, certainly those universities that are charging the highest fees, may put less effort into recruiting international students. They'll still welcome them, but I mean, perhaps it'll just become slightly less differentially valuable to them to do so. I don't know. As I say, there's no sign of that, but it's a theoretical possibility.
Kingston University. Do you think there is any indication that there will be a reverse move from students moving from the UK towards European universities, where courses are often delivered in English and where fees are minuscule in comparison?
Yeah, it's possible, and indeed we know that that's happening, but from a very low base to what remains a very small number. So I don't think, I'm sure, you know, it is happening. We know it's happening, and also to the States as well. But not, I think, sufficiently to make a big difference to the overall picture of the situation in England. We shouldn't be complacent about it. Europe's demography is in an even more parlous state than ours, and we've started to lose 18-year-olds from this year on, and will do for the last 20 years, and next 10 years. But the percentage reduction in Europe, in most European countries, of that population is much greater than in this country, and so there'll be even greater incentive on European universities to do two things. One is to hold on to their students already that they lose to us, because something like 4 or 5% of our student body is made up of EU students. Now, you know, if I were a Dutch or a Czech university, I would be doing everything I could to stop those students coming to England. So we'll do some of those students because of the efforts that are made. But also, I mean, interestingly, some of our students may start to go abroad. They are doing already. I don't think it'll be on a scale sufficiently to be very noticeable in the overall picture of things. No.
Hi, I'm Siobhan Smith from the Quality Assurance Agency. I just had a question. You mentioned that the ideology of introducing the market is kind of driving changes a lot of them. I wonder, what do you think that they're trying to improve by introducing the market? I mean, we see in other sectors like utilities the idea of efficiency and how that's worked.
Yes. Well, that's a very interesting question, isn't it? I mean, what's broke that needs fixing? Is that what you're saying, basically? You know, on many measures, we have quite a decent higher education system here. It's not a particularly expensive one. But don't forget that this is all, we're swept up in a whole, I think somebody already mentioned, already in the question, a whole, I mean, it's not just an isolated ideology, it's part of an overall approach that the government's adopting, and we're seeing it in the health service, and we're seeing it elsewhere as well. And actually I mentioned the Colorado experiment and the Colorado review. What was expected, and what is expected by a move to greater reliance on the market is greater flexibility, greater responsiveness, student choice, driving improvements in quality ultimately. And I no doubt that's why you asked the question from the QAA. But it comes down to quality, it comes down to efficiency. But I have to say that the evidence, to the extent there is evidence, suggests that a wholesale move to the market doesn't achieve that sort of thing. But I come back to my basic point, that we are not moving wholesale to the market. I mean, the rhetoric is about the market, but actually what we're moving to is very detailed government control over quite a lot. So there's this disconnect. Very interesting question. I'm struck that the Labour Party didn't have much response other than to say that they would have the fee at £6,000, but when pressed, they said, well, if they were doing it now, they would have a £6,000 fee. They're not saying that in the future they would have a £6,000 fee. And I have to say that the experience in the United States has been every time there's a squeeze on public, there's a recession or a squeeze on public funding, tuition fees go up. When the life improves and state funding increases, tuition fees don't come down. They stay high. They stay at the level. And I suspect that will be the case here. What I think will happen, though, is that as, and hopefully when, life gets more comfortable economically, public funding will increase. I mean, tuition may not come down, but public funding will increase one way or another. And there may be bigger subsidies and that sort of thing. That's the way that it might impact. And don't forget that Sir Alan Langlands, the chief executive of HEPI, who I think I've got huge admiration for, has, and no doubt, to the consternation of ministers, he's on record as saying that although universities are having to face cuts in HEPI funding now, they must prepare themselves sometime in the future to see an increase in HEPI funding again, and that the present regime is unlikely to continue in its full form. So, I mean, from that source, you have the view that the present arrangements, even under the present government, are unlikely to be set in stone. But what I anticipate myself is that tuition fees, the headline tuition fees, won't reduce, but they may be mitigated to some extent. And certainly there will be increases in direct public funding, I'm sure.
Lisa Atkinson, Oxford Brookes University. I just wondered, in the light of the fee changes, if you feel that there may be strong implications for humanities and arts courses and how the fees are.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I said is that it is more attractive to universities to provide humanities courses and to take humanities students than it is science and engineering students. That's on the supply side. On the demand side, it could just be that students, given a choice, will think that if they're paying all this money, they'd better study something that's going to give them a better prospect of earning a lot of money so they can repay the loans. On the other hand, I mean, by and large, I don't know how true this is, but by and large, I would imagine that most humanities students don't do science courses at universities because they're not equipped to do so. I mean, they've done the wrong subjects at school or whatever. I don't think there's any reason to think that there'll be a falling away of demand from humanities students particularly. That hasn't been seen in the United States, where fees have been traditionally much higher than this country. I don't see any sign, and I don't know, I haven't studied the UCAS applications data. I know that there has been a bigger drop in some subjects than others, and maybe there's some sign of it, but I don't think there'll be a wholesale exit from the humanities, and it'll be very much in the interest of universities to keep numbers up. So given this pool of unsatisfied demand, there's always, there has been, and there is at the moment, and given the imbalance between supply and demand that will continue in the future as numbers are held down by the government, I think that the humanities and social sciences are pretty safe, actually.
Will Lishman from Bucks University. You mentioned about effects on postgraduate fees. Can you expand on that? What do you think the effect will be, if any?
If I said postgraduate fees, I mean, I don't have any real knowledge or view about that. All I was, sorry, it was just a throwaway at the end. I mean, it is a matter of great concern, but it is simply the obvious one that if students are emerging from their undergraduate study with effectively a large debt. I hesitate to call it a debt because it's a funny sort of debt, but let's call it a debt. Will that, and it would make sense that it does, will that encourage them to start earning as fast as possible in order to pay that back? It could have the opposite effect, of course. It could actually make them even more determined to differentiate themselves from others by doing postgraduate study. But I think that I think I mentioned that as one of the uncertainties, along with part-time part-time student demand. I think the research postgraduates probably can be looked after through Research Council, increased stipends and all that sort of thing. It's the taught postgraduates that universities rely on to quite a large extent for their income. I mean, it's big business for universities, and increasingly big business is taught postgraduates. And so the question is, well, what will the effect of all this be on demand for that? One of the worries is that the white paper was utterly silent about that, and yet it potentially has massive implications. But the truth is, we don't know. Nobody has studied it as well as I know either.
Question at the back.
Douglas Blackstock, QA. Bahram, I wonder if you've done any modelling on the impact of the private sector. There's 90 or so institutions that get tuition fee funded through the student loans company, and they've been able to increase the fees to 6,000 from this year.
Yes.
And not subject to HEPI student number controls, as I'm aware.
No.
If that sector goes, what impact will be in the sector that does have number controls?
I know. That is, no, we haven't, is the answer to your question. But you're right to raise that as an issue, because that, of course, is something that would potentially, we don't know what would have gone into a bill. Oh, sorry, it's time to go. We don't know what would have gone into a higher education bill, but almost certainly some sort of statutory control, or the HEPI having some ability to impose its regulations on the private sector would have been part of it. In the absence of a bill, we have the private sector able to recruit students and no effective way of regulating that. And I think that is actually, some people chuckled and were pretty pleased when we lost the bill, but when the bill was lost. But actually, the main effect of the bill would have been to do things like control the private sector and enable some sort of regulation and subject them to quality regimes, which and it's uncertain at the moment whether it can be done at all, and if so, how. From where?
QA.
You're here. Is anybody left back at the office with the QA?
My question is about humanities and art subjects versus STEM subjects, and the cost of provision with STEM subjects being more expensive to deliver, and particularly medicine, where £9,000 a year doesn't really cover it. And I'm wondering at what point arts and humanities students are going to rise up to this, and do you see a situation where in the future there will be differentiated fee levels per subject?
Well, that is a possibility, and and it may. I mean, I have heard different things coming out of the government about this, because on the one hand, I've heard of an antipathy towards subsidy, because it's not a very market-friendly concept. But on the other hand, it's absolutely essential to have this subsidy in order to reduce the disincentive, or to avoid the disincentive becoming even greater for science and making provision for science subjects. I don't know. I personally take the view that a university is a university and it should be regarded as a whole, and cross-subsidy is an entirely correct thing to do. You'd want it, and you'd want sort of prosperous subjects to, and you'd certainly want the business school to look after the rest. So I think, and the other thing to say is, I know that in some jurisdictions, and Australia is the one I'm thinking of, they do have differential fees. But interestingly, the fees are higher for some of the social science subjects there than they are for other subjects, just simply because as a way of rationing provision, and as a way of getting more money in for the less, for the more expensive subjects. So in Australia, sort of law and economics, for example, although they're relatively cheap subjects to provide for, are actually charge more, and the students there don't balk at it. I agree humanities are different, because you're not going to do humanities because you're going to be earning a lot later. I don't think so, though, no. I mean, if you look at American universities, and I say we keep looking to America because they've got a much longer experience of the effects of fees. By and large, fees are the same for different subjects. Not always, but generally. So I don't you know, if you're concerned about whether students are going to put up with a subsidy, I think they will. I think by and large they'll pay whatever they have to pay. And universities, of course, are delighted to have this subsidy because it makes it easier for them. So I think it'll stay probably.
I think we're finished. Can I take this opportunity then to thank you again, Bahram, for your contribution to our conference today? And can we all thank Bahram again in the usual way?